When does a threat become a vehicle of hope? Hi, I'm Pastor Allen, and welcome to New Salem's Midweek Bible Study. Now, before I reveal that answer, please give this video a like and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already done so, make sure you're subscribed or signed up for notifications so you won't miss any of our videos. Now, here it is. A threat can become a vehicle of hope when the threat is made by the one protecting you against the one oppressing you. When you're being bullied, it pays to have a protector, doesn't it? That's what we're going to see in the second chapter of Nahum in the Old Testament. Now, as we've discussed in the previous couple of sessions, Nahum was a prophet in the tiny nation of Judah during the middle of the 7th century BC. At the time, Judah was being threatened by the Assyrian Empire, a large, powerful kingdom that dominated that part of the world for centuries. The Assyrians were known for their bloodthirstiness and their brutality. In fact, about 100 years before Nahum preached, the Assyrians had invaded Judah's neighbor, the northern kingdom of Israel. They destroyed Israel's cities. They deported a large portion of Israel's population, and they dispersed refugees from other portions of the Assyrian Empire into Israel's former territory in order to keep the area unstable and easily controllable. And Israel wasn't the only nation to suffer this fate at the hands of the Assyrians. And now the Assyrians were turning their attention to Judah and its capital, Jerusalem. In short, the Assyrians were bullying Judah and threatening to subject its smaller neighbors to the same treatment that had been inflicted upon Israel. In the last session, we heard Nahum argue why it was a bad idea to bet against God. In chapter 2, we learn why it's a bad idea to pick a fight with God. And make no mistake, in threatening Judah, the Assyrians were picking a fight with Judah's sworn protector. Now, here's something important to keep in mind as we work our way through these 13 verses. Throughout the chapter, Nahum appears to be addressing the people of Nineveh, Assyria's capital city. But what Nahum says to the Ninevites is ominous. And Nahum is not really talking to the Ninevites. Actually, he's sending a message to his own people in Judah. It was a message intended to give them hope that God hadn't abandoned them during this crisis. In verse 1, we hear God's challenge to the oppressor. Through Nahum, God says to Nineveh, "The one who scatters has come up against you. Man the fortress, watch the road, strengthen your back, summon all your strength." God's warning the Ninevites that they're about to be attacked. Starting in verse 3, he's going to actually begin describing an enemy army surrounding the city. But that army is only a tool being wielded by someone else, whose identity is hinted at by the words, "he who scatters." Now, the actual Hebrew word can be rendered as attacker or destroyer, but in the Old Testament, this particular word is used almost exclusively to refer to God himself. So God's warning the people of Nineveh that they'd better put up their dukes because they just picked a fight with God. As God tells the Ninevites to brace themselves for the coming battle, there is a bit of sarcasm intended, as Nineveh is about to suffer the same fate that they themselves had inflicted on so many other cities. In verse 2, we hear God's comfort to the oppressed. In verse 2, God briefly turns his attention to the people of Judah when he says, "For the Lord will restore the splendor of Jacob like the splendor of Israel, even though devastators have devastated them and destroyed their vine branches." Note that the people of Judah would face some difficult times. They weren't going to come through this unscathed. However, these difficult times would only be temporary. And in the end, God would restore splendor to Judah. As a lot of scholars have pointed out, there's something important in the Hebrew verb tense that Nahum uses that's not readily apparent in the English translations. The Hebrew verb translated as "he will restore" is given in the perfect tense, which we normally associate with a completed action in the past. This is an example of what scholars call the prophetic perfect. This refers to the way a prophet can talk about something that is predicted to occur in the future with so much certainty that he can describe it as if it had already happened. That's how sure this fate was for Nineveh. As Kenneth Parker and Wayland Bailey point out in their commentary on this passage, the implication is that for Judah to be restored, Nineveh would have to be reduced. As long as Assyria remained a threat, Judah could never truly be safe. Therefore, for Judah to be restored, Nineveh would have to fall. Now let's zoom out from that specific situation for a moment to consider the larger picture. As the prophet Isaiah predicted in Isaiah 25, verses 7 and 8, death hangs like a veil over all people. Yet God has promised to give eternal life to believers. Now, in order for that gift to be truly possible, then death itself has to die. Indeed, this is one of the promises wrapped up in the resurrection of Jesus. As the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 54 through 57, but when this perishable shall put on the imperishable, and this mortal will put on immortality, then will come about the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Getting back to Nahum, we see the assault on the oppressor described in verses 3 through 7. In Nahum 3, verses 3 through 7, we read, the shields of his mighty men are colored red. The warriors are dressed in scarlet. The chariots are enveloped in flashing steel when he prepared to march, and the cypress spears are brandished. The chariots race madly in the streets. They rush wildly in the squares. They appear like torches. They dash to and fro like lightning flashes. He remembers their nobles, for they stumble to the wall, and the mantelet is set up. The gates of the river are open, and the palace is dissolved. It is fixed. She is stripped, she's carried away, and her handmaidens are moaning like the sound of doves beating on their breasts. Now, a lot of historians have remarked that Nahum presents one of the most vivid and accurate descriptions of how such an assault on an ancient city would unfold. In fact, Nahum's description of the fall of Nineveh is so dead on that some have tried to argue he must have written it after the fact. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Throughout these sermons, Nahum addresses Nineveh as if it's still standing. And Nahum's descriptions would lose a lot of their dramatic punch, as well as their ability to offer hope to the people of Judah, if they were looking backward to something that had already taken place instead of anticipating something that was still to occur. Assuming that Nahum wrote this description a few years before Nineveh fell, he got a lot of the details remarkably correct. The first detail involves the origin of the attacking army. When the city of Nineveh actually did fall in 612 BC, it was at the hands of a combined army made up of Medes and Babylonians. And the Medes and the Babylonians of this era were known for coloring their uniforms and their equipment with vermilion, a bright red pigment made from mercury sulfide. Another accurate detail is the makeup of the invading force. The invading army would include chariots, which were kind of like the tanks of the ancient world. And you can imagine being in a city street and all of a sudden a bunch of chariots come racing towards you and you can't get out of the way. It'd be frightening. The army would also include infantry armed with spears. This was a fairly typical setup for such armies in the ancient world. Nahum actually also described how the battle unfolded. The invaders relied on speed and brute force, beginning their assault out in the suburbs surrounding the city, what's called the squares by Nahum's description, and quickly racing to attack the city's walls. Nahum may also have predicted one of the battle's most notable tactics. The reference in verse 6 to the gates of the rivers are opened and the palace is dissolved could just be a metaphor describing how quickly the enemy forces overwhelmed Nineveh's defenders, kind of like we saw happen in Afghanistan recently. However, Nineveh was situated on the banks of two rivers, the Tigris and the Husser, and they used a series of canals and locks to control the flow of water through the city. And two ancient Greek historians, Diodorus Siculus and Herodotus, report that the Medes and the Babylonians actually seized those waterworks and used them to selectively flood portions of the city during the assault. In any event, the fall of Nineveh was sudden and dramatic, and the Ninevites found themselves being subjected to the same kind of brutality they had inflicted on so many others. In verses 8 through 12, we see the aftermath of the assault defined. The horror to be inflicted on Nineveh's people is described. Though Nineveh was like a pool of water throughout her days, now they are fleeing. Stop, stop, but no one turns back. So Nineveh who was thought of being untouchable, kind of like a pool of water lying quietly, protected, all of a sudden is being poured out. It's being dried out, and the people are fleeing like the water spilling out of the pool. The people are running in panic. He goes on to say, plunder the silver, plunder the gold, for there's no limit to the treasure. So all of Nineveh's treasures, which they'd accumulated from that throughout their empire by plundering other people, would be plundered by the attackers. Wealth from every kind of desirable object. She is emptied. Yes, she is desolate and waste. Hearts are melting and knees knocking. Also anguish is in the whole body, and all their faces have grown pale. Again, I think about some of the images we've seen lately coming from Kabul, with people gathered around the airport trying to leave the country as their country fell to an invading force. And you can imagine the horror and the terror taking place in the city of Nineveh, which thought itself to be invincible, as these Medes and Persians in their silver equipment and silver uniform, or excuse me, red, crimson uniforms and red equipment are racing through the city, and everything is falling so quickly, and no place is safe. The destruction of Assyria's prestige is also described in very poetic terms in verses 11 through 12. Where is the den of lions and the feeding place of the young lions? Where the lion, the lionesses, and the lion's cub prowled, with nothing to disturb them. The lion tore enough for his cubs, killed enough for his lionesses, and filled his lairs with prey and his dens with torn flesh. Now, you got to understand that the Assyrians often used the image of the lion as their national symbol. One would think of the lion's den as being a place of safety and security for the lion's mates and children. Yet when the invaders came, the place of safety would be destroyed. The lion's family depended on the steady flow of food the lion brought in. In this case, these would be the spoils that the Assyrian armies captured from the cities they conquered and brought to Nineveh. Nineveh was a very rich and supposedly a very beautiful city, very elaborate city, but it became rich off the blood and treasure of conquered peoples. And here, the description is being given of that flow of spoils from other nations being put to a stop when the city falls. In verse 13, we have the declaration of God's intent, kind of a summary statement here. In verse 13, we read God's direct challenge to the Assyrians. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. I will burn up her chariots in smoke. A sword will devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the land, and no longer will the voice of your messengers be heard. So imagine kind of like in the Old West days when you have two gunfighters standing in the street and one of them challenges the other. God is standing before the Assyrians as the Lord of hosts. And there you'll notice probably in your Bible, Lord is in all capital letters. That's to let you know that in Hebrew, this is God's personal name, that special name he revealed to Moses at the burning bush, and under which he signed the document, the contract with the law of Moses, the covenant with the people of Israel. This is a very special, holy name, and it represents God in his essence. And as the Lord of hosts, he is the one who commands all the armies of heaven. So here's the Assyrians on one side with their mighty military machine that had conquered so many people. But then arrayed against them is the creator of the universe and all the heavenly armies. Now, how do you think that battle's going to end up? The wording is very similar to an ancient formula used to challenge opponents to a duel. In fact, I encourage you to go back and compare this to the challenge that Goliath made to the armies of Saul back when David came out with a slingshot. It's very, very similar. And we're told here that God would first of all cut off the Assyrian power, their chariots, which represented their military might. God would cut off their progeny, their young lions, their young men would die in this attack. God would cut off their prophets, the prey, the spoils that they had collected from the cities they had conquered. And then God would cut off their prestige. In the ancient world, when the Assyrians were at the top of their game, a lot of times before they attacked the city, they would send a herald, an official messenger from the Assyrian ruler, to lay an ultimatum before the city, to invite the city and give them a chance to surrender peacefully before the Assyrians would launch their assault. And in the ancient world, you never wanted to see one of these messengers show up on your doorstep. It was never a good sign. And a lot of places did surrender just on the threats being brought by that messenger. But here, God is promising that he's going to silence these messengers. They'll no more be sent out. Now, there's some lessons we can learn from Nineveh's fall. I mean, there's not, if you're looking for really deep theological meat in this passage, you're probably not going to find it in every detail. But there's some big things that this passage tells us about God and about how God stands for his people. One, in his own time, God's going to judge ruthlessly those who side with ungodliness or unrighteousness. And think about what Paul says in Romans 1:18, how the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. We also draw from this story that not even the mightiest nation on earth can hope to withstand God when he determines to bring judgment. And that's a lesson for any nation. It was a lesson for the Assyrians, but it was also a lesson for the people of Israel, who thought that, because of their success and because they had enjoyed God's blessings, that that blessing was going to continue forever. They took it for granted and neglected their relationship with God, and as a result, they too experienced God's judgment. We also see in this story that God often works through earthly actors and circumstances to carry out his will and his judgment. It may have been the Medes and the Persians who actually carried out the attack, but God's the one had maneuvered them and raised them up and put them into place. Now, they didn't even realize they were fulfilling the plan of God. They thought they were working out their own agendas, but God, in his great sovereignty, had put all the pieces on the board and moved them like a big chess game to bring about the result that he wanted. We also see in this passage that we often reap what we sow, as we're told in Galatians 6:7. The Assyrians had sown all kinds of brutality and evil throughout this region of the world. They had conquered so many people and stolen so much wealth from other nations. And here, they're going to experience, according to Nahum's prophecy, experience the same kind of treatment that they had dished out to so many people. This is what they had sown, and now that was what they were going to reap. And that's a good warning to all of us. Be careful what kind of seed you're sowing, because one day that seed's going to produce a crop. And it may not be the kind of crop that you want to harvest. And then finally, we see that ultimately God will bring victory and restoration to his people. There may be difficult times. There may be threats. There may be enemies. But in the end, God gives his people victory. Now, these lessons can either be a challenge or a comfort, depending on which side of God's line you stand. If you want to know more about what it means to choose God, then please reach out to me at pastor@newsalembaptist.net. Next time, Lord willing, we're going to close out our study of Nahum and his vision of God's protection of his people. Until then, keep walking in faith.